Did you know the very first illegal immigrants in America were actually Americans? Or that US officials literally used to measure people's skulls to test their intelligence? Forget everything you learned in history class. Today, we are exposing 33 of the absolute dumbest, most bizarre, and genuinely shocking facts about US immigration. The government literally sprayed people with toxic chemicals and gave them IQ tests using wooden blocks. Let's look at the madness. 1. Imagine arriving in a brand new country, completely exhausted from weeks at sea, and an inspector hands you a bright yellow, violently curved object you have absolutely never seen before in your entire life. That was the hilarious reality for thousands of immigrants arriving at Ellis Island who were given bananas as a welcoming snack. Because this tropical fruit was completely unknown in most of Eastern and Southern Europe at the time, these poor, hungry people just started taking massive bites right through the bitter, thick peel. They chewed on the tough outer skin, absolutely disgusted, probably wondering why Americans loved eating such terrible, dry food. Imagine the absolute panic of the port workers trying to pantomime how to peel a fruit to a crowd of hundreds. It was basically a giant, chaotic game of charades just to prevent mass indigestion. 2. If you want to talk about illegal border crossings, you have to look at the original rule breakers, who were actually the Americans themselves. Back in the early 1800s, the territory of Texas was completely owned and controlled by Mexico. But American settlers just kept crossing the border illegally, totally ignoring Mexican immigration laws and setting up their own towns. To make matters even more incredibly ironic, Mexico had officially abolished slavery. But these American migrants kept smuggling their enslaved workers across the southern border anyway. The Mexican government was absolutely furious and tried desperately to build military border forts to keep the illegal Americans out. They literally became the exact thing modern politicians endlessly complain about on television today. It is the ultimate historical irony that the foundation of the Lone Star State was built on massive organized border jumping. 3. Medical inspections at Ellis Island were basically a traumatic speedrun, but nothing struck pure terror into the hearts of new arrivals quite like the dreaded eye exam. Doctors were desperately looking for a highly contagious eye infection called trachoma, which meant instant deportation. But they did not have fancy medical equipment. Instead, they used a common household tool called a buttonhook, which was normally used to yank stiff buttons through tiny holes on Victorian boots. These doctors would take that cold metal hook, shove it under an immigrant's eyelid, and violently flip the eyelid completely inside out to check for disease. They did this to thousands of people a day, frequently wiping the exact same metal hook on a dirty towel between each terrified patient. If you somehow did not have an eye infection before getting in that line, you definitely had a high chance of catching one right there. 4. Border security is usually a massive deal with armed guards and heavy steel fences. But there is a building that completely laughs in the face of international borders. The Haskell Free Library and Opera House was deliberately built in 1904, sitting directly on top of the borderline between the United States and Canada. The boundary literally runs right across the reading room floor, marked by a simple black line on the carpet. You can legally walk right through the front doors in Quebec, Canada, stroll across the room, and sit down to read a book in Vermont, United States. You do not need a passport, you do not need a visa, and absolutely nobody is going to check your bags for contraband literature. The building actually has 2 different mailing addresses and 2 different phone numbers depending on which side of the room you are standing on. 5. We have all heard the classic family legend about a confused Ellis Island inspector ruining a beautiful European last name because he could not spell it. Well, that entire story is a complete historical myth. The inspectors in New York absolutely never changed anyone's name. They were actually highly educated, spoke multiple languages, and worked directly from the exact passenger lists created back in Europe. The real culprits were the lazy, overworked shipping clerks back in ports like Bremen or Naples. Those clerks would just scribble down whatever phonetic nonsense they heard before the ship even left the dock. These exhausted ticket agents simply wrote down whatever letters sounded vaguely correct over the deafening noise of the crowded European ports. By the time that piece of paper reached New York, your family history was already permanently altered by a guy who just wanted to go on his lunch break. 6. Long before modern dating apps, the lonely men of the Jamestown colony in 1619 figured out a truly bizarre way to find a wife. The Virginia Company realized their male colonists were miserable and threatening to abandon the settlement, so they literally imported 90 single women from England to serve as mail-order brides. But this was not a free matchmaking service. If a colonist wanted to marry one of these newly arrived women, he had to pay the company a massive shipping fee of 120 pounds of pure tobacco. That is roughly the equivalent of buying a luxury car today, just to get a spouse. This bizarre agricultural transaction literally saved the colony from total collapse because the men finally had a reason to stay and build actual homes. Nothing says true romance quite like being valued at exactly 120 pounds of highly addictive dried leaves. 7. The United States government was terrified of letting poor people into the country who might end up relying on public charity. To prove you could support yourself, inspectors demanded that every immigrant flash at least $25 in cash, which was a massive fortune back then. But poor migrants are incredibly resourceful. Entire groups of strangers would secretly pool their tiny amounts of money together, or just borrow a single $25 bill from a wealthy passenger. One guy would confidently show the money to the inspector, walk through the gate, and then secretly slip that exact same bill through a crack in the fence to the next guy in line. It was an absolutely brilliant, low-budget scam that completely outsmarted the rigid federal bureaucracy. The United States government thought they were filtering out the poor, but they were actually just testing their teamwork and sleight of hand skills. 8. Imagine being denied entry to a city just because a random police officer thought you were not good-looking enough. Starting in the late 1800s, several major American cities actually passed horrific legislation literally known as ugly laws. These absurd local laws made it completely illegal for anyone considered unsightly, deformed, or visibly disabled to show their face in public streets or squares. This was specifically weaponized against poor, newly arrived immigrants who had suffered severe injuries in terrible factory accidents or arrived with physical disabilities. If an immigrant stepped outside to get some fresh air and a cop decided they were too unpleasant to look at, they could be slapped with a massive fine or thrown straight into a dirty jail cell just for existing. These cruel ordinances stayed on the books in some major cities for decades, essentially criminalizing the simple act of looking different. 9. When you think of the very first physical barrier built on the United States and Mexico border, you probably imagine a fierce effort to stop human migration. But the reality is incredibly stupid. The first real border fence was erected in 1911, and it was built entirely to stop cows, specifically Mexican cattle that were carrying a nasty parasite called the Texas fever tick. The Department of Agriculture was terrified these foreign bugs would infect American herds, so they ordered a massive wire fence to be built across Southern California. They literally deployed armed guards to patrol the desert, not to check passports, but to aggressively chase away wandering livestock. The grand, heavily militarized border security system we fiercely debate today basically started as a massive pest control project. You have to laugh at the fact that the original border crisis was entirely caused by a bunch of itchy cows completely ignoring international treaties. 10. We view the Founding Fathers as these majestic figures of liberty, but Benjamin Franklin was basically the angry guy yelling on the internet about foreigners. Back in the 1750s, Franklin was absolutely furious about the massive wave of German immigrants moving into Pennsylvania. He wrote angry essays complaining that the Germans were incredibly stupid, totally ignorant, and completely incapable of understanding American values. He was genuinely terrified that they would outbreed the English settlers and force everyone to speak German. He even warned that these German foreigners would swarm the elections and completely destroy the local government from the inside. The man who discovered electricity and helped draft the Declaration of Independence was literally having a massive public meltdown because he thought too many people were eating sauerkraut. It proves that absolutely baseless panic about new immigrants ruining the neighborhood is a tradition literally as old as the United States itself. 11. The food culture shock at Ellis Island was absolutely real and sometimes downright hilarious. alongside the famous banana disaster, another amazing culinary misunderstanding involved ice cream. The incredibly kind charity workers at the immigration station would occasionally hand out scoops of vanilla ice cream as a special welcoming treat. But most of these exhausted travelers from rural European farming villages had never seen or tasted ice cream in their entire lives. They looked at this pale, yellowish white scoop and logically assumed it was just a really fancy, incredibly cold serving of butter. So they naturally started spreading this freezing, sweet vanilla cream all over their black bread, taking massive bites and wondering why American butter was so shockingly cold and weirdly delicious. You can only imagine the sheer shock on their faces when that freezing, sugary dairy hit their tongues instead of salty fat. 12. If you arrived in America and did not speak a single word of English, the medical inspectors still had to figure out if you were smart enough to enter the country. Their brilliant solution was to treat grown adults like toddlers at a daycare center. Doctors would hand these exhausted, terrified farmers a pile of wooden puzzle blocks and demand they put them together to form a shape. Or they would hand them a pencil and tell them to draw a diamond from memory. Imagine surviving a brutal 3-week ocean voyage, leaving your entire life and family behind, only to be handed a piece of paper and told your entire future depends on your ability to quickly sketch basic geometric shapes. If your hands were shaking from pure exhaustion and you drew a slightly crooked square, you could be stamped as mentally defective and sent back across the ocean. 13. United States immigration policy is famous for being incredibly complicated, but the rule for Cuban migrants was straight out of a bizarre, high-stakes game show. For decades, the government used a policy literally called wet foot, dry foot. The rules were simple but completely absurd. If the Coast Guard caught a Cuban migrant while they were still in the water, even if they were just 1 inch away from the beach, they were immediately deported. But if that exact same person managed to physically touch the dry sand of Florida before getting tackled by authorities, they won the ultimate prize and were allowed to stay legally. People would literally sprint through the shallow water while heavily armed guards chased them, hoping to just slap a palm on the dry sand. It turned serious immigration policy into a ridiculous televised sporting event where the penalty for losing was losing your freedom. 14. Today we are used to endless paperwork, biometric scans, and massive visa interviews just to cross a border. But before World War I, the concept of needing a passport to enter the United States was basically science fiction. For most of the 19th century, you literally just bought a boat ticket, survived the terrible journey, and walked right off the ship into New York or Boston. There were no visas, no background checks, and absolutely no passports required. You simply told the guy at the desk your name, promised you were not a dangerous anarchist, and walked out into the city to start your brand new life. The government simply did not care where you came from as long as you had 2 working hands and were ready to build railroads or work in factories. The golden age of immigration was basically an international free-for-all with zero paperwork and infinite possibilities. 15. The American Civil War was a desperate bloodbath, and the Union Army needed fresh meat for the grinder. Their brilliant strategy was to target totally confused people who literally just stepped off the boat. Military recruiters would hang out right at the docks in New York City, waiting for massive ships full of Irish and German immigrants to arrive. Before these poor guys even understood what city they were in or where to find a cheap hotel, recruiters would shove a cash bonus in their faces and trick them into signing enlistment papers. Many of these men did not even speak English and had zero idea why they were suddenly wearing blue uniforms and holding heavy rifles. It was the ultimate bait and switch, turning hopeful new arrivals into instant cannon fodder before they even tasted their first American meal. 16. You probably think your constitutional rights are perfectly safe as long as you are physically inside the United States. But thanks to a completely wild legal loophole from 1953, the Border Patrol has extraordinary powers within a 100-mile radius of any external boundary. This includes the entire coastline of the country. Inside this massive invisible zone, agents can legally operate checkpoints and search vehicles without a traditional warrant. The absolute craziest part is that nearly 65% of the entire United States population lives inside this zone. This means the entire state of Florida and most of the East Coast are technically operating under completely different constitutional rules. It is a massive, invisible dragnet that turns everyday American cities into active federal enforcement zones without anyone even realizing it. 17. Nobody likes getting shots, but late 19th century immigrants took avoiding the needle to an entirely new criminal level. To enter the United States, you had to strictly prove you were vaccinated against smallpox. If you did not have the distinctive round scar on your arm, the inspectors would aggressively vaccinate you right there on the spot with a massive, painful needle. Because people were terrified of the dirty needles and the nasty side effects, a bizarre black market completely exploded. Migrants would actually pay scammers to burn their arms with acid or hot metal to create perfect, fake smallpox scars. These black market scarring artists made an absolute fortune preying on the medical fears of desperate travelers. It is wild to think that permanently disfiguring your own body with acid was considered a smarter move than just letting a professional doctor give you a quick poke. 18. In 1911, the United States government decided to get incredibly weird and incredibly racist with science. A massive federal committee called the Dillingham Commission released a gigantic 41-volume report meant to analyze the new wave of immigrants. But instead of just looking at economics, they hired a guy to literally measure the physical shapes of people's skulls. They used a debunked pseudoscience called phrenology to measure the heads of newly arrived Italians and Slavs. The government actually published official documents claiming that the physical shape of an immigrant's skull proved they were biologically inferior and prone to criminal behavior. They spent millions of taxpayer dollars trying to mathematically prove that certain humans were physically built to be criminals based solely on their hat size. It was state-sponsored racism disguised as high-level biology, and it successfully ruined the lives of thousands of hopeful families. 19. If you failed the medical exams at Ellis Island or just did not want to deal with the strict American inspectors, there was a hilariously easy cheat code available. In the late 19th century, thousands of European immigrants simply bought a boat ticket to Canada instead. The Canadian ports were way more relaxed, and once you landed, you just took a train south and literally walked through the woods into the United States. The northern border was completely unguarded. There were no fences, no cameras, and no border patrol agents hiding in the pine trees. You basically just took a scenic nature hike across an invisible line, and suddenly you were a resident of the United States. It makes modern debates about massive concrete border walls seem completely hilarious when you realize the original border was just a bunch of unguarded pine trees. 20. The United States government used to have a brutally sexist law that essentially punished American women for falling in love with the wrong person. Under the Expatriation Act of 1907, if a woman born and raised in America married a foreign immigrant, she instantly and automatically lost her United States citizenship. She was legally stripped of her rights and declared an alien in her own home country, just for signing a marriage certificate. But here is the absolute kicker. If an American man married a foreign woman, nothing happened to him at all. If she wanted her citizenship back, she literally had to go through the entire grueling naturalization process, just like a brand new immigrant. It was a legally enforced punishment for falling in love, proving the government cared way more about controlling women than protecting national identity. 21. Walking through Ellis Island was incredibly stressful, mostly because silent doctors in blue uniforms were intensely staring at you. As you walked up the massive staircase, these doctors would look for any sign of weakness, disease, or mental illness. If they saw something they did not like, they would pull out a piece of thick chalk and aggressively draw a large cryptic letter right on your coat. An E meant you had eye problems, an H meant heart disease, and a massive X meant they suspected you had severe intelligence issues. Families would frantically try to wipe the chalk off each other's coats before reaching the final inspection desk, knowing their entire future was on the line. That tiny piece of white chalk held more power over human lives than any judge or jury in the country. 22. Modern political campaigns spend millions of dollars on television ads, but 19th century politicians in New York City had a much more direct strategy. The corrupt political machine known as Tammany Hall would literally send agents to the docks to greet arriving immigrant ships. They would grab confused, exhausted Irish and German men, hand them a hot meal, and march them straight to a corrupt judge who would instantly make them American citizens on the spot. Then, they would immediately march these brand new citizens to the voting booths and tell them exactly who to vote for. These corrupt bosses literally ran the naturalization courts like a fast food drive-thru, stamping papers at lightning speed. It was the absolute peak of dirty politics, turning confused, hungry foreigners into a massive, unstoppable voting army in less than 24 hours. 23. In the 1850s, a massive wave of anti-immigrant paranoia swept across the country, leading to the creation of a powerful political group called the Native American Party. But they operated more like a weird, paranoid underground cult than a real political party. They held highly secret meetings and were absolutely terrified of immigrants finding out about their plans. If a member was stopped and asked about the group's activities, they were strictly ordered to reply with the exact phrase, "I know nothing." When politicians were asked about their aggressive anti-immigrant policies, they would just stare blankly and repeat that exact same ridiculous phrase. It was basically a nationwide political gaslighting campaign run by guys who thought sounding completely clueless was a brilliant tactical strategy. Imagine naming your entire political movement after your own admitted total ignorance. 24. Border control took a highly toxic turn in 1917 when the mayor of El Paso started a massive panic about typhus coming from Mexico. The completely unhinged response was to force all Mexican workers crossing the border to strip completely naked and take a mandatory chemical bath. Officials literally sprayed these people with a highly dangerous mixture of soap, kerosene, and even toxic chemicals used to kill bugs. The process was deeply humiliating and incredibly dangerous. The idea that you had to be blasted with highly flammable chemicals just to cross a bridge is pure dystopian madness. Finally, a brave 17-year-old Mexican woman named Carmelita Torres refused to take the toxic bath, convinced the crowd to fight back, and sparked a massive riot that completely shut down the border crossing. Carmelita became an instant local legend for finally standing up to this deeply abusive policy. 25. The term green card is famous all over the world as the ultimate symbol of permanent residency in the United States. But for decades, the government made the absolute worst design choices, turning the name into a complete joke. The very first cards issued were actually green, but then the government suddenly decided to change the color. For years, they issued cards that were bright pink, pale blue, and even plain white. Millions of immigrants were walking around holding a bright pink piece of plastic, still legally required to call it a green card. Imagine the complete confusion of trying to explain to an employer that your bright pink identification paper is technically called a green card. It took the federal government over 50 years to finally fix this incredibly simple, hilariously stupid branding error and make the cards green again. 26. Legal documents are usually filled with complex, highly professional terminology, but the Immigration Act of 1917 reads like a bunch of angry middle schoolers wrote it. This official federal law specifically banned people with mental disabilities from entering the country, but the medical categories they used were absolutely wild. The United States Congress legally passed a bill stating that no idiots, imbeciles, or morons were allowed to cross the border. Those were not just insults back then, they were actual, highly official medical diagnoses used by the government to rank human intelligence. These wildly offensive playground insults were treated as highly serious scientific classifications by federal judges and medical professionals. It perfectly highlights how completely unhinged and scientifically baseless early 20th century immigration laws actually were. 27. When the United States Border Patrol was officially created in 1924, you would assume their main job was stopping illegal immigration. But the country was right in the middle of prohibition, and the government was absolutely obsessed with stopping alcohol. So instead of guarding the border against people, these newly hired agents spent almost all of their time desperately chasing down bootleggers and smugglers who were sneaking cheap whiskey in from Mexico and Canada. The early Border Patrol agents were basically just heavily armed alcohol monitors, engaging in massive high-speed car chases through the desert just to confiscate a few crates of tequila. The government was so absolutely terrified of people having a good time with a beer that they completely ignored actual border security. It was a massive misallocation of federal resources that turned border agents into glorified bartenders. 28. The second president of the United States, John Adams, was incredibly paranoid that French spies were going to destroy the country. So in 1798, he signed the Alien Enemies Act, which gave the president the absolute power to arrest, detain, and deport any male citizen of a hostile nation during a declared war, without any real trial. It was a massive dictatorial power grab. But the absolute craziest part of this story is that Congress never actually repealed it. This incredibly ancient paranoid law from the 1700s is technically still active on the books today. The fact that a law written when people still wore powdered wigs and rode horses can still be used today is absolutely mind-blowing. It is a terrifying legal zombie that refuses to die, just waiting for the next major global conflict to be weaponized all over again. 29. The Chinese Exclusion Act was a brutally racist law that completely banned Chinese laborers from entering America. But Chinese immigrants invented an absolutely brilliant loophole. If you could prove you were the child of an American citizen, you were allowed in. So, an entire black market of fake families was born. People in China would buy highly detailed forged documents claiming they were the son of a Chinese American living in San Francisco. These young men, known as paper sons, would spend months memorizing hundreds of pages of fake family history, including the exact layout of their fake village and the names of their fake neighbors. If they forgot a single detail, like the exact location of the village water well, they would be instantly deported back to China. It was a massive, incredibly high-stakes memory game where the ultimate prize was surviving the harshest immigration laws. 30. Entering the United States was not just a massive physical struggle, it was also a literal financial shakedown by the federal government. Starting in the late 19th century, the government decided to charge a literal head tax on every single immigrant arriving by boat. It started out at just 50 cents per person, which was annoying but manageable. But the government got greedy, and by 1907 they jacked the price up to $4. Then they doubled it again to a massive $8 per person. This massive fee forced many families to completely drain their life savings before they even bought their first meal in America. The government was basically treating the border like a highly exclusive nightclub, aggressively charging a VIP entry fee to the poorest people on Earth just to walk through the front doors. 31. In 1924, the United States passed a wildly racist immigration law designed to keep out Asians and Eastern Europeans by establishing strict national quotas. But they did not just check what country your passport was from. They aggressively checked your literal bloodline. If you were born and raised in London, spoke perfect British English, and held a British passport, you should have easily gotten in under the massive British quota. But if the inspectors discovered that your grandfather was Chinese, they completely ignored your British citizenship. They would classify you by your race, throw you into the incredibly tiny Chinese quota, and deny you entry. This meant your physical passport and your actual birthplace were completely worthless if the inspector decided your ancestry was wrong. It was a deeply flawed, mathematically absurd system designed entirely to legally enforce blatant white supremacy at the border. 32. The Cold War paranoia of the 1950s produced some truly extreme laws, but you might be shocked to learn that one of the biggest ones is still strictly enforced today. Under current United States immigration law, any person who is or ever was a member of the Communist Party is legally banned from getting a green card or becoming an American citizen. It does not matter if you joined a mandatory youth group in China when you were a teenager, or if you live in a country where party membership is required to get a decent job. The United States government still treats you like an active Soviet spy from 1985 and will flat out reject your application. You could be a completely harmless grandfather, and the United States will still treat you like a massive national security threat. It is a bizarre, outdated relic of the Red Scare. 33. During the massive economic collapse of the Great Depression in the 1930s, white Americans were desperate for jobs and started aggressively blaming Mexican immigrants for ruining the economy. The local and federal governments responded with a massive, terrifying deportation campaign officially called the Mexican repatriation. They rounded up massive crowds of people in public squares, shoved them onto trains, and dumped them across the southern border. They deported an estimated 1 million people during this panic. But here is the most horrifying, completely absurd fact about this massive purge. Historians estimate that roughly 60% of the people they deported were actually legal native-born citizens of the United States. Families were completely torn apart, and natural-born Americans were dumped into a foreign country they had never even visited. It proves that during an economic panic, the government will absolutely throw its own citizens under the bus. So, your great-grandparents probably scammed their way through Ellis Island with a borrowed $25 bill, and the government was too busy chasing cows to stop them. Be honest, if an inspector handed you a wooden puzzle right now after a 3-week boat ride, would you be officially stamped as a moron and deported? Defend your intelligence in the comments. If this video made you question everything, hit the like button and subscribe for more.